focusing on both of those. Ah. And I have been focusing mainly on the election administration side of things because that's what's going to affect the most people. But starting off with kind of how things have changed, this election is going to have every state house and Senate seat and a primary, a Democratic primary for one U.S. Senate seat, as well as some primaries for every U.S. House seat. So there's a lot of action on the ballot. As far as the state legislature is concerned, incumbents haven't been able to raise money because the legislature has technically not adjourned yet. And so that's caused some consternation. There was a 2 hour state ethics commission hearing where lawmakers were trying to figure out if they could get around that by reimbursing themselves after the session was over and things. And so you really won't see that probably affecting too much of the fundraising because many of the incumbents already had well stocked campaign war chests. But it will be interesting to see. There's a handful of contested state house and Senate primaries that are worth watching. And it's also kind of ruined one of the hallmarks of campaigning, which is door knocking and get out the vote efforts. Nobody's doing door knocking in the middle of a virus and a pandemic. So that's kind of pushed some of these higher profile races to be more digital, like the press club debates or these digital forums or TV ads and social media blitzes that you usually wouldn't necessarily see from these Senate candidates. And, so people are having to get creative. One thing that has helped transitions over to the election administration side of things. The Secretary of State's office mailed an absentee ballot application to all 6.9 million active registered voters, which kind of makes it easier for people to vote by mail, which is not something that most Georgians have done before. And we've seen well over 1 million people return those absentee ballot applications, which means they will get an absentee ballot mailed to them. Now, for context, in the 2018 governor's race, when Stacey Abrams made vote by mail a central part of her campaign, about 250,000 or so people chose to vote by mail in that election. And so we've already got about 5 times as many people interested in voting by mail just for this primary election. And so what that has done is that has maybe opened up the arena. There's a great guy, Ryan Anderson, has this site called GeorgiaVotes.com where he takes the absentee voter file data and runs it with all the voter files that he's done to show what percentage of absentee ballots are Democrats, what percent are Republicans, what percent are people who have never voted before. And increasing the access to vote by mail in Georgia has, for this primary, put a lot of different people voting that haven't necessarily voted before in primaries or just in elections, period. And that could end up shifting things, making some things tighter in some congressional races and other things. But the other thing to look at, early voting starts Monday. And with all of these changes to voting, there's going to probably be problems, not necessarily bad problems, but all the county elections officials are trying to change how they do things and prepare for, social distancing at the polls and different things like that. And so you're probably going to see reports of long lines at early voting sites. And a lot of that is by necessity because, normally if you stand front to back with somebody in line, but now you're going to be at least 6 feet behind. So the size of the line and the time it takes to get through isn't necessarily indicative of there being big problems, but it's going to be a new reality for places to figure out how they're voting. We've seen counties close early voting sites because they don't have enough poll workers. Fulton County, for example, has, I think, about 5 early voting places when they would normally have 20. Counties are closing election day voting locations because they don't have enough poll workers. And so that's going to be problematic for people trying to shift where they vote that they might not already know where they're voting to begin with. And then we're going to see also issues with, the backlog of paper. Fulton County is still processing applications, and so their numbers are way behind, but they've had well over 100,000 absentee ballot applications out of a registered voter population of about 700,000. So really, we're just looking at an unprecedented election, both in terms of how it's being run and who's on the ballot. You have two very competitive Republican primaries that are probably in Republicanly held seats in North Georgia. You've got a competitive Democratic and Republican primary in the 7th congressional district. And then you've got the competitive Democratic primary for U.S. Senate that will likely head to a runoff. So all that to say is this is a big election. There's a lot of things to look at, and there's a lot of things to look out for in the next 4 weeks or so before we get to Election Day.
Thank you, Stephen. I mean, I don't know if we want to start a discussion now, but we've got, you kind of covered the gamut of a lot of the topics that all of us are curious about. Are there any specific races that you are particularly keeping an eye on that may be surprising or?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there are some primary challenges that are in name only that probably won't get very far. Buddy Carter has a couple of Republican challengers in the 1st district. John Lewis has a Democratic primary challenger in the 5th district. But you have, like I said, the ones to look out for, the 7th district will head to a runoff, both on the Republican and Democratic sides, because of the sheer number of candidates that are there that have been fundraising and drawing attention. The 9th congressional district, which is the one that Doug Collins currently occupies, but he's giving up to run for Senate, is going to have a competitive Republican primary and runoff. And then the 14th congressional district, which was open once Representative Tom Graves announced that he was resigning, is also going to head to a runoff. And a lot of these races, you have Republican challengers that are self-funding their campaigns with, $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 donations. And there's not really clear front runners in any one of those races. And with enough challengers in there, we'll definitely head to a runoff. But the 7th district, there's both Democratic and Republican. There's really about 3-ish candidates in each of those primaries that could. It's just a matter of who's going to be the two that makes it into a runoff. And then with the Democratic Senate primary, you had 4 main big ticket candidates. Then Ted Terry dropped out in January. Now he's endorsed Jon Ossoff. A lot of people view it as Jon Ossoff and Teresa Tomlinson making it into the runoff. So I guess what remains to be seen is how well Jon Ossoff does outside of Metro Atlanta and how well Teresa Tomlinson does inside Metro Atlanta. And so there's no shortage of races to watch. In the state legislature, one interesting race to watch is the primary for State Senator Brandon Beach, who was running for the 6th congressional district and then said he wasn't. And now he's running against State Representative Michael Caldwell. And Beach has been under fire for being one of the senators that was infected with COVID-19 that, ended up having, like a 10th of the Senate test positive for it. And so he's under a lot of scrutiny for that. And so that may be one of the few state legislative primary races worth watching, unless you're just interested in the young representative trying to challenge Jeff Mullis that put out this, campaign ad earlier this week saying that, Jeff Mullis bought and paid for by lobbyists, and there was a cameo by like somebody pretending to be Greg Bluestein in there and things like that. But there's those are kind of some of the big races to watch. But with this level of voting and with this level of enthusiasm, it'll be a little hard to read too much into the tea leaves of how these votes turn out and how these votes go. I will say we looked at absentee ballot applications by congressional district, and in about half of the congressional districts, there are way more Democratic ballots being requested in this primary than there were in 2018 and 2016. And some of it is because there are Democratic challengers in these races, but also some of it is the Senate race and other things like that. So vote by mail, typically, you've heard from some Republicans in Georgia nationally that they speak against it because they think that it helps Democrats more. But looking at the data, both parties actually benefit more from vote by mail because more people in general vote, and it doesn't really target one demographic or one party over the other when everyone has the same access to an easy way to cast their ballot from home.
Another question I have about that is, or just about the pandemic in general and how it's affected this. Obviously, things being delayed and postponed to new dates is one. But with Georgia opening up the economy and certain businesses opening, just personally, what do you think, how do you think that will impact the actual physical turnout on June 9th?
I'm actually working, I was actually just finishing touch on a draft of a story about this right before the call. But, I think typically these primary elections are lower turnout elections, but the vote by mail and everyone staying at home isn't necessarily making people switch from voting in person to voting by mail. It's just adding a lot of people who don't normally vote to vote by mail. A lot of county elections officials I've talked to said that there are still plans for, a lot of people have called and said, is this early voting site open? How long is it open? I'm still planning on coming in and things. And so there should still be a number of people voting. Right now, about 20, on average, I think about 20% of the state's registered voters have requested an absentee ballot. And so, if somehow there was going to be 50% turnout for this primary, which they won't, that's still 30% of people showing up. But, even if the total turnout for this race is closer to 30%, that's still 10% of the state's 6.9 million active voters showing up. So you're still going to see, in some of these bigger counties, tens of thousands of people show up to the polls. And some counties before the pandemic embraced vote by mail and early voting more than others. And so early voting, there's 3 weeks in a day. So you may have a lot of people, but it's spread out over the course of, the 3 weeks of early voting. And so we've also looked at some counties vote almost exclusively early voting, and some counties vote almost exclusively on election day. The ones that vote on election day, and people typically vote on election day, are going to be in a lot more stressful position come June 9th. If those people don't vote by mail or vote during early voting, if everyone tries to show up at the polls on election day, lines are going to be even longer than normal, and there's going to be even more things spaced out. And that's even assuming that their polling place is even open, because many polling places are in churches or senior centers or other places that have the ability to say, no, we don't want you to be a polling place. You can't come here. So really, the way voting works in Georgia is, you have 159 counties and 159 ways of doing things. And so when it comes to this election in particular, where you live is going to directly affect how easy it is to vote, or how long your line's going to be, or what kind of issues and things there are going to be. I mean, there are some counties in Georgia that their entire elections budget for a year is a rounding error for a metro Atlanta county, or what a big county spends on office supplies. So this has really been putting a lot of officials to the test, because at the end of the day, they have to balance both the legal statutes for how many poll workers and how many machines they have out and all these other sort of protocols with the health protocols and guidelines to keep people away from each other and not in close physical proximity, and cleaning the machines and things like that. So it's a task that I don't think very many people understand, let alone appreciate the difficulty that goes into it.
One of the things we've been doing with the check-in over the past few weeks is having journalists tell us about sources and their source for information. I know that it can be for just a regular voter, let alone a journalist. It's been hard to kind of keep up with all the changes on the different websites that offer information, the state websites and the Secretary of State's site and all that. Have you had any problem getting correct information, or do you feel like it's just the basic information about dates and places and how-tos as far as the different ways to vote this year? Has it been a little more obscured than usual? I don't know.
I mean, I wouldn't say obscured, but it's 5 days until the start of early voting. And I've talked to county elections officials this morning who aren't 100% sure where and how their early voting is going to take place on Monday because of problems with the buildings or poll workers being uncertain, or, different things like that. So it's not a matter of obscuring or hiding information. It's that there are so many moving parts and pieces to it that, any story that I do is just a momentary snapshot in time that could disappear by the time I get it edited and published. And so, this is where a lot of times, going directly to the source, the county elections office or the county website, if a county even has a website, is going to be the best way to get information. And, really there's a lot of, there's a lot of information that a lot of people don't need to know, but the stuff that they do need to know that particularly pertains to them, usually people figure out, a way to do it. Like some of the more rural counties I've talked to, like, there's one, Bacon County Elections has a really good Facebook page where the supervisor there posts, a couple times a day, different things, different tips and tricks and notes from the Secretary of State's office and reminders and things that, those are more, better ways that, in a paper or on the Secretary of State's website or a press release, those aren't necessarily the ways that people are getting their information about how things change. And it's kind of more on a community level and from their sources. So, yeah, I would just say that people need to understand that it's, everything is upended and things are a work in progress. And so, checking directly with the source is probably going to be the best source of information.
And Sheena, you had a question about the trends.
Yeah, I have two questions actually. Going back to what Stephen was talking about at the very beginning, like the door-to-door knocking and that kind of campaigning, which is something I hadn't thought. Is there any data on how much that actually helps in a normal election campaign cycle?
Well, I think, Garland mentioned in the chat that, a lot of things are direct mail and direct to voter communications, but the door knocking element certainly does target people that maybe are on the fence about voting or maybe don't know as much about a candidate. In 2018, the Democrats ran a coordinated campaign where, it's not a ticket, you have to vote for each race independently, but a lot of their campaign literature and things like that mentions the Stacey Abrams and Sarah Riggs-Amico and, various candidates all the way down. And so it is a good informational awareness thing, but not necessarily at a level that can tip the scales, other than, for example, the Democratic Party of Georgia didn't really have much of an apparatus in many rural counties and places outside of the metro Atlanta that presidential campaigns and others put together in other places. So they built that up for the 2018 election. So now somebody went knocking on a door in 2018. Now they have a better idea of who their voters are, where their voters are, and it's building up the infrastructure. Same with the Republican Party of Georgia. I think last summer, the chairman told me that there were like 20-something counties that were solidly Republican counties, Republican county commissions, voted Republican for president and everything like that, but didn't have a local party apparatus, where they had regular canvassing and phone calls and meetings and things. So I think the more levels of organization a party or a campaign or something has, the less surprised they are when election results come out. And so I think not having that on the ground level of detail and communication is kind of a big question mark, especially because there aren't very many polls and things out. And so, it's hard to get a sense of, who voters are and what their interest is in voting or what kind of messaging could get them to vote. And so I think that's probably one of the biggest things missing about door knocking.
Interesting. And yeah, another question about, you mentioned there's some counties that just kind of always vote with absentee ballots and others that don't. And I was wondering, and Raul said he can address this too, so I'm going to unmute Raul here. But is there any trends? Like, I'm curious if rural counties are the ones voting in person versus voting absentee, or vice versa, or what? Raul, you're unmuted too, so if either of you want to jump in.
So, well, because we haven't had voting yet here early voting in person starts on Monday. In terms of the numbers, at least 2 of my counties tell me, when you compare to just 4 years ago in the primary, one of the counties I cover, Greene County, I think, was it Greene or Putnam? One of my counties, and I'm going to get all the numbers on Friday, said they've already gotten more ballot requests than actual number of people who actually voted in the primary 4 years ago. So, whether it's, and that person was wondering, just people are bored and have nothing else to do. They are prepared, and I am right now going through my counties one by one, and at least for 3 of my rural counties, and I still have the rest to go through, they have not closed any polling locations. They're going to be able to keep this. I do want to mention, and I think it's been affected by what's going on with COVID. In-person campaigning is still big in rural Georgia. And I think it's going to affect the race that's in Sandersville, Washington County. Mac Jackson may be a name that some of you know. Mac Jackson was the only Democrat to vote for the heartbeat bill. And so he picked up a Democratic opponent, and absolutely was a race at the top of my list. But the inability to campaign out in rural Georgia and to go door to door and to do that kind of work has probably affected that race. And we'll see what happens in the last couple of weeks here. But at the moment, we're seeing a lot of people asking for ballots in rural Georgia, and at least the counties I've talked to. We'll see what happens when the actual numbers start rolling in.
Yeah, and I would say too that, like, absentee balloting is still a very small percentage of how people vote in Georgia, but early voting has picked up steam in different places. Some counties in the last decade have closed a number of polling places and precincts and consolidated down because of how many people early vote. An example is Butts County, that had 5 voting locations at the start of the decade and now just has the 1. But if you go and look back at their historical voting records, about 80% of their people vote during the 3-week early voting period that's held at the 1 location in the county office. And so, they've slowly inched that number up because most of the people use early voting. So they had, people, 7 or 8 poll workers working in a location that saw maybe 100 people all day, when there were, a couple thousand registered in that district. And so early voting is still big. And so we'll see with this explosion of absentee how many people in places early vote. But then, if more people vote by mail, then that's fewer people in person at the polls. And if more people vote during early voting, then that's fewer people on election day. So it will really just have to see how things tend to go. I do know there are a lot of places that do use early voting because it's that 3-week long period. There's a Saturday day of voting where it's more accessible to people. And so now that everyone's at home, it may be more or less accessible to go to early voting. So it'll just have to be seen kind of how the county numbers shake out.
Okay, does anybody else have some questions? You can send a little text in the chat to let me know that you're ready. Stephen's here to answer your questions, and then we will transition. I've got some screen share articles and things I want to share in a minute.
I do have one question, Scarlett, for Stephen. Stephen, I hope I don't lose you. I'm on a hotspot, and my internet's down today. Comcast is down. But I wondered have you gotten any complaints yet from voters who have not voted in the presidential preference primary, and they want to vote in a different political party in that versus the Georgia primary election, and they can't do that. Have you run across any of the voters complaining about that yet?
Not exactly. So there were about 300,000 people that voted in the March presidential primary when it was just president. And you could pick a party for that. And so those people, when they vote in the June election, will have everything but president on their ballot. And so everyone else will have the presidential race and all of the other races that apply to them on the ballot. And so I guess what you're saying is there are some people that theoretically might want to vote in the Democratic presidential primary, but then the Republican legislative and other primaries, or vice versa. But you can't do that now because it's all on the same race. And so I haven't really heard too many people talk about that, but I guess, at this point, the presidential race is a bit of a moot point. So, other than, I guess it's Georgia's votes will not change the outcome of either presidential nominating contest. So I guess people, unless it's symbolic, won't necessarily need to do that. But no, it does add another layer of complication to the race because there's all the different ballot styles to begin with, and then you add maybe the presidential or not the presidential on there, and then you have absentee ballots that were sent out that say for March 24th and some for May 19th and some for June 9th, and most of them count, but not all of them do because some of them are old, and it's not the most user-friendly election this time.
Does anybody else have a question for Stephen?
Stephen, do you happen to know if they're still sending ballots? Like, have there been any delays in that or anything like that?
So the delays, there's still delays in counties processing applications to then put it into the system, which is then sent to the third-party vendor that is printing and mailing out these ballots on behalf of the state. Fulton is still working through a backlog. I think over a week and a half ago, they had received about 135,000 and processed about 17,000. And so I don't even think they're up to 135,000 yet, which means all the ones that have come in since then, including the ones that will still come in the next 4 weeks, like mine, because I haven't done mine yet. There's going to be that level of backlog. But then the third-party vendor that we have is not just printing Georgia ballots. And there's a lot of other states that are shifting things. I think I just saw that South Carolina's governor just signed a bill that would allow all South Carolinians to vote absentee, which is not their norm there. So there aren't that many places that are able to print, mail, and secure millions of pieces of paper and election mail. And so with all of these states shifting things, there are some delays. And then, like I said, you've got, I talked to an election official today that said in a busy, good year, they received 10,000 absentee ballots and they've already processed 40,000. And that just takes the human scale of opening it up and processing the application and entering it in the system and making sure that it's done right and checked and all of that sort of things. It's it just takes time. I mean, Fulton had to close their office for a couple of days because they had an elections employee die from the virus. But when they opened it back up, they turned the county atrium into a processing center and had 24 other departmental employees that were, instead of furloughing them, they had them just work and process ballots all day. And even with a couple dozen people processing things, Fulton is still tens of thousands of ballots behind. So this is a lot more manual labor, human focused process. So there are definitely going to be delays, which is why counties are telling people to vote by mail and vote as soon as possible so that there's enough time to get everything done in the process.
Stephen, you know the employee that did pass away from Fulton County? Do you know who that
Mhm.
was?
It was she was a retired part-time elections clerk. Um, I'm blanking on her name, but we did a story about her. So
And guys, one thing to add in when you think of the smaller counties, yeah, they're sometimes they've been delayed because they only have a handful of employees in your smaller counties, well outside of Atlanta. And when they get all these applications, it does take them. There is a bit of a gap to get everything and opened and going. And I'm trying to remember. One of my counties gave me just this unbelievable number of ballots. I want to say she has 78 different ballots because of all the possible, and that's not the norm. I mean, most counties, rural counties, they have 10, 15 ballots because you've got different districts that cross each other. But I've had some that have so much more because of all the different iterations of ballots.
yeah, and like I mean, and especially if you look at the numbers by county, the two counties that are the lowest number of applications completed is Fulton, but then also Dougherty County because they're in the middle of the pandemic and their county offices and buildings haven't been open and people aren't thinking about voting as much. And so, I talked to one county over in Lee County. I talked to the election supervisor and she said it's just her and one other person in the office processing, 27,000 registered voters. If only 10% of them do it, that's two people going through almost 3,000 pieces of paper.
Hey, Stephen, I have a question about the drop-off locations or Dropbox. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, just in general?
Yeah, so there was an emergency rule passed that says typically absentee ballots, you got to mail them back in for the most part. But there's an emergency rule passed that is allowing counties to basically, it's like a Dropbox that you have at the mail post office, that like a secure Dropbox that people can come drive up and drop their stuff off and not have to deal with the person, not have to vote at the polls. It's mainly for the big metro counties. Those have been the ones that have taken it up because they can afford it and or have the locations to do it. But it's just another way for people to avoid high traffic, high human contact areas. And it's supposedly just for this election cycle, but it wouldn't surprise me if that rule sticks around and it's just incorporated into part of the infrastructure because I don't see Georgia completely shifting to vote by mail, especially not after all the brouhaha with the voting machines. But I do think that Secretary Raffensperger has done a lot to expand access to it so that people who want to vote by mail can. And while the state's not going to mail ballots or mail applications to every single person every year, certainly adding parts of the infrastructure to make it easier for people to do, especially as the virus continues to linger. I think that's something that office has indicated that they're willing and interested to do in spite of their Republican colleagues across the country.
Thanks. It's too soon to tell, I'm sure. And just based on what you said about the human capital that's required to even process the votes in the primary, do you have any predictions in terms of between June and November, any other innovations or additions or ways that voting could change for Georgians between now and the general election, other than, just voting by mail again?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to have to see how this election goes and turns out. I mean, basically everything has been one giant question mark the whole way through for these counties figuring that out. But the runoffs, they'll be more prepared than they are for this one. And, then it's the November election, but we should have a better idea more of testing and protocol. I mean, counties don't even have protocols for what they do if somebody shows up and starts coughing and sneezing at the polls. And I mean, we asked them and they said everything from, ask them to vote by mail or spray them down with Lysol. I mean, So, there's all of these different things, but I think so much is just going to depend on what things look like, both with the spread of the virus and kind of how things work economically. If, I would imagine there could be more poll worker recruiting because the average age of a poll worker in Georgia is 70, and those are not the people that you want to have risking it. It gives places more time to get PPE for their staff. It gives them more time to finagle with voting locations to see if they'll open back up or stay open or change, because churches right now can strong arm, the counties can't strong arm places into be voting locations. And a lot of rural counties, all of the voting locations are county owned buildings. So they don't have somebody telling them no, but like, Cobb County, they've been trying to add a polling place for a while, but there were maybe 2 buildings that met the legal definitions for polling place in this new proposed precinct, and both of them said no. And you can't strong arm somebody into being a polling place, especially not if there's a global health pandemic. So I think the more time between now and November, there still may be higher numbers of people voting at the polls, especially, if the state is encouraging people to do it. But I think in-person voting, this is going to be a good trial run to see what things look like and kind of have best practices in place. Because honestly, I think, if you have to stand in line and you have to stand 6 feet away from somebody, and then you have to go and there's only 3 machines in there because they have to be 6 feet apart, and, the election supervisor opted to distance the machines instead of meet the legal minimum for how many they're supposed to have in there. Somebody does that once and they may be like, you know what, I am going to vote by mail in November. Or I'm sure there's inevitably going to be some national news outlet that comes down here and, does some horror story about, how ass backwards Georgia's voting is. And then I'm going to tell them to fuck off. And then, we're just going to have, these horror stories, and people are going to read that and be like, you know what, I don't want to get in that. And then, we'll go from there.
Stephen, I kind of piggybacking off that, do you, maybe you don't know or don't want to guess, but what do you think, I don't know, in 4 years when we do, or 2 years when we do another big national election, or 4 years or whatever, do you think any of this will change the way America votes?
I definitely think so. I just shared a link to an article that I was interviewed for, that Neiman Reports article about different reporters and places across the country that are changing the way they cover campaigns because of the change in the virus and kind of focusing on election administration and things. 4 years is so far away. I mean, that's 2 different congressional, that's 2 different House races away. That's 2 different sets of Senate elections away. That's a presidential election away. I mean, we could be looking at,
And Stephen, don't forget, we have to also redraw all the lines for the next election.
Yeah. I mean, there's redistricting and things, we'll still probably have the same number of representatives, but, there's things could be completely different. I mean, we could be, it's hard to tell without, seeing who's running the show at the top, how the White House and Congress does things at a federal level, but then even at the state legislative level, it's hard to see how things go. I mean, I think the better question, you can't go past November, and November is even then too far to try to figure out how things go. But certainly this has kind of reignited the conversation around voting and how we do it. Before the session was suspended, there was a law that the Secretary of State's office was trying to get pushed through that said that polling places that have lines longer than an hour at any given point throughout the day would have to figure out how to either hire more staff, get more voting machines, or split the precinct into a smaller size to try to cut down on long lines at the polls. And so, if that were to take effect and change things, it could change the way of voting. But then that's more money, and that's more money that cities and counties in the state isn't going to have because of the coronavirus. But then there's also pushes for the concept of vote centers, where you could vote anywhere in your county, which still doesn't. It's the same kind of general premise as the voting precincts that we have now, given the way they're drawn. But it's hard to tell. But there's a lot of changes happening, and there's a lot of uncertainty. And I think you see a lot more willingness by people to explore other options and alternatives, because voting has inherently become a political topic, but public health crisis affecting everyone regardless of party has kind of made people reconsider how things are done.
That's good. Well, one of the things we've been doing with the check-ins also is just sharing some information that could be helpful to reporters online. So I've linked in the chat area, I've linked to Stephen's main page on GPB News there. And then Stephen has also shared a link to that national reporting. But I wanted to show you too, there's just some very basic information that I found helpful. I'm going to share my screen if I can, just a second. Did that work? So here's Stephen's page here. And then Stephen does report on voting, but other topics as well, political reporter. So that's great. That's a great source of information. Also, the AJC, WAB, and others have some good information. The Georgia My Voter page, we were kind of perusing it earlier, looking for all of the calendars, and we came across a PDF that actually doesn't even have June 9th on it at all. So I know that this page can be a little confusing, but it is there for you. And I believe, and Stephen, you can maybe answer this. Do you know about, so supposedly you can come back to the My Voter page to see if your ballot, your mail-in ballot has been received? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, so when you check your My Voter page, if you have submitted absentee ballot application and ballot and other things, it will update your status. So you will be able to see in the bottom if it's accepted or rejected, or when it was mailed and things like that. So yeah,
Okay.
you can see it there.
Okay, well, that's comforting, maybe.
Hey, Christy, the way to do that is on the MVP login, you enter those 4 boxes, and then you press submit. You could actually check yours now if you wanted to. And then on the left-hand side, about halfway down, you'll see a link that says absentee ballot status.
Yes.
And you click on that, and that's how anyone can do that. We have instructions out there on how to do that with VoterGA.
Okay, good. And then we've got just some FAQs that WABE put together, which may be helpful to point you to some more sources if you are reporting on voting this week or in the coming weeks up until June 9th. I've also included that link in the little sidebar as well. Just some popular questions here if you are reporting on it. So yeah, so those are those things. Does anybody else have, this was the calendar, the voter registration calendar. Does anybody else have anything they want to ask Stephen while we have him on?
Yeah, Christy, I just have a quick question. Stephen, going back to your point, Christy, about the drop boxes. Stephen, do you know what counties have those? And I'm assuming that if a county has it, it's every zip code has a postal drop box.
No, so this is different than it looks like a post office drop box, but it's not. It's on a different county, county-owned building and things. I know Fulton and Cobb have them for sure. Some other counties are putting things up. They're still trying to figure them out and procure them and source them, so there's not really a big list, but those are kind of the main ones.
So they're not using the post office to do that?
No, it's just because, for safety and security reasons, it literally looks like a big post office box that you can drop something in, but you can't easily take something out so that, nobody steals your ballot.
So they'd be using government buildings to do that then?
Yeah,
So
Yeah, in the emergency rule, they required it to be, it's like on a county-owned building or something, and I think some counties have like put it like outside the elections office or outside the courthouse or something like that.
So there really is no way for the voter to know where they could drop that then.
I mean, the county elections office should have that information since they're the ones that put it together, but I don't think there's a central repository of where you could find that. No.
Thanks.
Hey, Sheena, can you let me share something? So to answer your
yeah, you're good.
to answer your question, so here's well, it's still not working. Still disabled. Well, I was going to show you a picture of it. I have a picture of the one that's in Baldwin County, Georgia, and it really does look just like the mailbox. It looks like a mailbox, but it's completely white, and it's right outside the courthouse. And then there's a similar box in Morgan County, but it's inside the building, so you still have to do it during regular hours. So it depends on where you are.
Thanks, Val.
No problem.
Stephen, what do you think with, like, considering how many more people are going to be voting by mail, considering, just how different this election is going to be, what would you expect election night to look like for journalists this year? Like, are delays going to be even more delayed than usual? Are returns going to be more delayed than usual? Like, what should people planning to cover it expect?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we're not going to have results for the big things until a couple days after, because all of those absentee ballots coming in, the earliest counties may be able to open and start processing those is the morning of the election. And maybe the Secretary of State's office might explore some emergency rule changing that to allow them to just open things. But if you have, say you have 1 million people return absentee ballots spread out throughout 159 counties, it's going to take time for 1 million absentee ballots to be counted and put into the system. And then they have to do the tabulation using the new voting machines. But the actual breakdown and tabulation part of the new voting machines will be much easier than with the old DREs, because the new voting machines, under the old machines that we used before, the poll worker had to take out the memory cards of every single machine, accumulate them all into one memory card, then take that memory card back to the central office where it gets uploaded. But now, since it prints out a piece of paper that's then scanned and tabulated in the scanner, there's one memory card per precinct scanner. And all you have to do when the election's done there is, wrap everything up with that scanner and then deliver to the county office. So the time you would gain by having a new voting system is now lost by having all these absentee ballots and having to get them processed, because even with these high velocity scanners that counties will have to tabulate in their office, it's going to take a long time to get things through. And what people always forget is that by law, counties have to upload results at least three times throughout the course of election night. And so usually the first results you see come in are absentee results, but you will see a fraction of those absentee ballots come in just because of the scale of things. And so if anyone tells you they have results on June 9th for any of these contested primaries, or if they're trying to use the Secretary of State's website to say there's results, I mean, you're not going to see it.
So Stephen, is it your understanding that they can begin the signature verification in the morning of Election Day, and then they actually can't physically count them until 4 o'clock in the afternoon, right?
For now, yes, but given the sheer volume, I know the Secretary of State's office is exploring options to just kind of blanket let every county tabulate early.
Okay, great. Does anybody else have any questions for Stephen? Okay. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for coming today. I do want to go ahead and take this last couple of minutes to let you know about some events that we have coming up next week as part of our Newsmaker series. On Monday, May 18th at 2 p.m., we have Stacey Abrams talking about voting. We also have on Thursday, May 21st at 11 a.m., we have a great panel discussion in conjunction with the Carter Center about mental health stigma and the pandemic's effect on that, featuring Nicholas Kristof from the New York Times, Nick Valencia from CNN, Eve Bird, who is the Director of Mental Health Programs at the Carter Center. And we also have Kathleen Ether. I'm not pronouncing her name correctly, but she is in charge of social and behavioral sciences at the CDC. So she'll be joining us. That'll be a great panel. That's May 21st at 11 a.m. All of these are free events, so you can just register on our website at atlantapressclub.org. We also have U.S. Attorney B.J. Pack rescheduled from a previous event that was canceled due to the pandemic. He'll be joining us on June 9th at 11 a.m. So these are great events for reporters, and I'm sorry we can't do them in person, but we're going to try the new Zoom webinar format and see how that goes. So we hope you'll join us for that. And then we will be announcing another series of check-ins after Memorial Day. So thanks again, everybody. We appreciate you coming.
Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, thanks for doing it, Stephen. Chrissy, I sent you that report from last week. You got it right.
Yes, thank you. I'll pass that on to the debates. And Stephen, anybody who wants to check out Stephen's reporting, please do that at the link. I wanted to make sure we got that in. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Raul.